What is textual criticism? Well, in the context of the Old Testament, before we define how that word is applied in the realm of smarticle people, we're going to first discuss what the individual words mean, textual criticism, and in reference to the Old Testament. First, we need to understand that when we're trying to do something like textual criticism, what we're looking for is evidence, and evidence is defined as something that makes something else more likely to be true. When it comes to 100% certainty, it's quite a stretch for someone to say they can be 100% sure about anything. They could even just end up changing definitions and say, well, even if it is 100% apparent that Shady Oak here is wearing a red shirt, then I could explain that away by saying, well, how do I know for sure that red is actually what I'm seeing? I could be colorblind, so that little fudge factor, I guess, would factor into that. But the more evidence that I give you, the more examples of things that are red, the more colorblind tests I give you, this would be evidence to show that this shirt is red. So, then building on that point, if we're looking for evidence, we're not demanding something be 100% certain, since any loser could come up with another bizarre rule that you have to make. But if, on the other hand, you say, I've given enough evidence that gives you more reasons to believe this is true than false, then we're getting somewhere. That's what evidence is. The second word is, of course, in textual criticism. What is criticism? People generally think it's just being a negative Nancy and pointing out the flaws in everything by your subjective opinion. That is not the definition of criticism. Criticism is actually acknowledging strengths as much as flaws. And while a critical eye can spot things wrong with something or someone, it can also acknowledge strength. A compliment is a criticism of somebody's positive traits. And so if we recognize that textual criticism isn't necessarily saying everything that's wrong with the Bible, we can treat it in a positive way. So then, what is textual criticism? Well, building on our definitions, here's our quiz here, kids. What are we talking about when we say evidence? Something that makes something else more likely to be true. What is criticism? It's pointing out strengths and weaknesses. So what is textual criticism? It's using evidence to point out the strengths and flaws in a text. Generally, and especially in the realm of ancient text, anything over 1,000 years old, we're not going to be able to or should expect to find more than 2 or 3 pieces of people, places, or things that would even mention it. But when it comes to the Bible, we actually have a lot more than that, and we need to know not only how to recognize what is evidence, what counts as evidence among the scholarly community, but also what that means for us as Christians so that we can know for certain that what we're reading today is what they wrote then. So, textual criticism in the most simplest of forms, there are others, but it's going to be seen most commonly in 3 different ways. The first is comparing the earliest to the latest. If we can get as close to the original as possible and compare it with the ones that we're printing today, we look at it and decide what are the differences. Obviously, it would be translated into different languages, but did they lose something in that transition? I look at the earliest, are there books or verses or even chapters in there that aren't necessarily in the one we're reading today? What happened? It's these kinds of comparisons that textual critics look for. The second is the majority of evidence available. Instead of just looking at the earliest and the latest, they check out all of the copies that have happened and have been made in between. And this would give us an understanding not just if changes have taken place, but where and when they have changed at all, and under what circumstances, in what culture, and, ultimately, if this error took place, how did it affect those after them? If everything in the New Testament was fine, or Old Testament, I guess in this case, until a certain point, and then all the copies got this new introduced factor, we'd look at that point and say something happened there to change all the others. They copied that copy, and the copy ended up corrupting all the ones after it. So this is where they use majority of evidence to determine where and when any errors, mistakes, or changes have been made. And then finally, the third, most common at least, there are others, but form of textual criticism would be the comparison of other texts that we have during that time. So, say, for example, if we have memoirs of World War II that clarify for us based off of manufacturing capabilities, technology, the individuals and their birth dates who invented said technology, and their technology being used before said time, we'd point out that as an anachronism, an error in history. If someone said there's, these stealth bombers flying across the sands of D-Day. Well, you could write that all that you want, but because of the fact that the stealth bomber that we generally refer to in the United States wasn't invented until a few decades after World War II had ended, let alone when it was still going on, we look at the text at that time, we compare it to other texts, say when the B-52 bomber was created, and realize, thinks one of these made a mistake, because we can know when the bomber was made. We aren't exactly sure that lines up with what we know about World War II. So in regard to the Old Testament, they would make these sort of analytic approaches. They would ask, okay, if it's talking about customs, for example, did they exist during the time that they claim these were written in? If they mention the names of kings, did they live in that time frame? If they mention individuals that we can test, because no, we're not going to be able to test everything if we don't have evidence. We don't conclude something based off of what we don't have, we conclude it based on what we do. That's textual criticism. But we want to make sure that we're being as objective as possible, so noting that this is used by atheists as well as Christians to test the Bible, remember that that's not the issue. The issue is whether or not we are coming to an objective conclusion with the text. Because our goal, of course, is not to prove the Old Testament false. That would show that our goal in mind is to find flaws rather than strengths. That's not criticism. Or at least it's not objective criticism. If, on the other hand, I want to prove something true, it's going to make me want to look for strengths. But understand, with the comparison between the two, if I'm trying to prove something true, I'll always find another explanation as to why the good isn't good enough. That puts me in the unreasonable realm of things. But if I want to prove something true, I'll be willing to give the benefit of the doubt to the positive evidence, which is the whole reason why we're doing criticism in the first place. If I then switch back and wonder, oh, well, aren't the people who don't believe the Bible more objective? Well, I don't know who wrote that rule, but understand the difference between a test and a attempt to sabotage. If a, say, for example, teacher gives you a test, it is more often than not the case they want you to succeed. But if, on the other hand, you're trying to be fired from a job and are given a series of tests, quote unquote, in that department, they're going to try to get you out because that's their goal, and you're not really going to like the people who are involved in that second process. So we want to be on the positive end. We want to look for evidence, be willing to give for the benefit of the doubt as far as the strength or weakness of that evidence. And if there isn't evidence, then we don't try to make some up. We're honest. We acknowledge this can't be proven, but we have more reasons to trust it because we have other things that are trustworthy, that we can prove more is true in the Old Testament than can be proven false. If you want to prove something false, I'm sure you could explain away all the data and say that there is no evidence that I accept. But that's not what you would call objective. If, on the other hand, you say there is some evidence, but not to the satisfaction of other things that we have in ancient history, wouldn't disprove it, but it certainly would make it shaky. The good news is that even for the anti-theists' requirements, the Old Testament does stand on fairly stable ground for old history, ancient history, especially over 1,000 years. So now that we've defined our terms, we know what textual criticism is, the various forms it is most commonly presented. I'm going to utilize those three and apply them to the Old Testament with you all here today. So first, regarding the earliest to the latest, making sure that the earliest copy matches up, or at least is somewhat resembling what we're reading now. When it comes to what changes have taken place between the Old Testament today and the oldest copy that we have, the plain answer to that question, how many changes have occurred between now and then, the most straightforward answer is none. The longer answer to that question is that the evidence is as follows. There are two major, and there are plenty of others as well, I'll list them for you, but there are two major collections and two major complete copies, for the most part, of the Old Testament that we have been able to discover in ancient history and archaeology that would be before and after the time of Jesus Christ. So if someone were to say that Christian interference made the Old Testament fit into the New Testament, they have a problem because we have Bibles before Christianity existed. Likewise, if someone is to say, oh, well, Jewish culture was invented at this such and such a time, and so on and so forth, well, if our earliest copy goes a long time before Christians or Jewish communities would be capable of such a thing, let alone willing to make those changes, then the person making the claim has a problem. The evidence is in the two major complete copies of the Old Testament are the Masoretic text, which is what the majority of modern translations, including the King James Version, is based on today, the Old Testament at least, and the Dead Sea Scrolls, which I'm sure has become a familiar name for all of you, and it should be. We'll be going over both. The Dead Sea Scrolls were dated around 2,300 years ago, which is a very long time, and the Masoretic texts were dated to around 1,100 years ago. Still a long time, but when it comes to ancient history, that is fairly recent. So, noting both examples, and both being virtually identical to the Old Testament that we're reading today, we want to make sure that we are not just saying this, we can support it. So, what are the Dead Sea Scrolls in order to properly understand why this would count as evidence? Well, the Dead Sea Scrolls were writings, collections, made by the Essenes, which were a Jewish community that lived before and during the time of Jesus of Nazareth, that were simply Jewish people. But because of their attempts and endeavors to obey the law and keep themselves separate from the influences of their society, they built communities in southern Israel and made it their goal in life to essentially be the ancient librarians and record keepers, not only of their Bible, but also of their own writings and books as well, which is why you find books like 1st through 5th Enoch, 1st and 2nd Maccabees, and their apocalyptic end times literature also included in the Dead Sea Scrolls. Doesn't mean they belong in our Bibles, but they do have the Jewish Bible with them because they were Jews. And this, of course, is referring to the Old Testament. It's also important to note as well that when they were making these copies, they did an incredibly good job. In the copies of the Old Testament books we have available, every single one is accounted for with the exception of Esther. If you'd like to know how we know Esther belongs in our Bibles, feel free to ask in the comments. It's an entirely different test on its own. But these copies obviously weren't the originals. And dating some of them goes back 300 years before Christ and others even farther. This would prove that it was not made up by Christians because the term Christian didn't exist until Christ came along. In fact, it was never made and said by Christ. It is recorded for us in the book of Acts, where the Christians in Antioch were made fun of using this term. And they embraced it happily, and we still bear the title today. So, noting the copies that we do have, the ones that we have one copy of are Ezra, Nehemiah, and 1st and 2nd Chronicles. It would be one collective book. So these are the ones written after the exile. The ones we have two copies of are Joshua, Proverbs, and Ecclesiastes. So noting the founding of Israel's borders, wisdom literature, and of course Solomon reflecting Israel's most prestigious king at the end of his life and reflecting on those matters. We have two copies of each, Joshua, Proverbs, and Ecclesiastes. We have three copies of the books of Kings and the book of Judges, so 1st and 2nd Kings as well as the book of Judges. This is very significant when it comes to Israel's history, including the historical context, by the way, of Solomon and the prophets as well. The ones we have four copies of are 1st and 2nd Samuel, Israel's first king Saul, and Israel's greatest king David. The book of Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Job, Ruth, Song of Solomon, and Lamentations, which are all extremely influential and lengthy books. They have four copies each, and we can compare them all to the ones we're reading today, virtually identical apart from changes within the language itself, not in the message communicated within and what is allowed by that language. What we have 6 copies of is the book of Numbers, recording Israel's history during their wanderings in the wilderness, very significant. We have 8 copies of the book of Leviticus, all of the minor prophets, meaning going from Joel all the way to Malachi, and the book of Daniel, noting big time significance for that last one, because Daniel includes a numerical prophecy that predicted not only to the day when Jesus would enter into Jerusalem on Palm Sunday, but is even more significant in that he went into details about things that were far beyond Daniel's lifetime in the 6th century BC, and explained to us the rise and fall of Alexander the Great, the rise and fall of the Medo-Persian Empire, and the fall of the Babylonian Empire. While Daniel witnessed the fall of the Babylonian Empire, he did not see how the Medo-Persians fell to Alexander the Great, how he divvied it up to his generals, 4 of which, by the way, he named, not of course by name, but noted the number 4, split them into 2, who ultimately became 1, who persecuted the Jewish people, and went into these details centuries after his lifetime. Skeptics, of course, try to explain this evidence away and say that a pious fraud, which is a kind of a contradiction in terms, made this stuff up to fit it all in order to inspire his culture. The natural response after that is not only why would a pious person commit fraud, but even then, if I assume your case, why is it that we have evidence of Daniel's writings before the time where Alexander the Great's influence reached its zenith? This is what is very important to note when you're discussing these things with people. We have 16 copies in the Dead Sea Scrolls of the book of Genesis and Exodus, foundational information for the whole Bible. 18 copies of the book of Isaiah, including a complete and pristine copy that has lasted over 2,000 years. And note as well, Isaiah is in his prophecy detailing for us some of the most significant things about the life of Jesus 300 years before he was born, and we certainly don't believe that Isaiah was one of the Essenes living in the 300s. We have it on good authority that it was 800 years before Christ he wrote these things, and we can verify that it was the same thing before Jesus as it was after, as far as what the writing is concerned. We have 25 copies of the book of Deuteronomy, which were the last several series or sermons rather, that Moses made before his death, and they entered into the Promised Land. And they have 27 copies of the book of Psalms. So, noting the very interesting collection of evidence that we have of these fragments and whole copies of these collections of literature that are included in our Old Testament today, we could know 3 things from the Dead Sea Scrolls. 1, that the Old Testament books, as we know them today, existed before the time of Jesus, that the ones that we can test in wording, as well as the communication that the language would provide, are the same then as they would be in Hebrew today, and making adjustments for modern language would translate into English quite nicely, so long as someone isn't funking around with the translation. I am, of course, referring to the New World Translation. The Jehovah's Witnesses were the first individuals in history that made a conscious effort to distort a translation, but before that time, we have every reason to recognize and can verify that with evidence, note that keyword, that the Dead Sea Scrolls do show us that this is, in fact, the same Bible that they were reading then. But our Bibles, for the most part, aren't based on the Dead Sea Scrolls. They were discovered very recently. What about the Bibles that we have translated for us today? What were they based on? Well, that's why I wanted to mention this as well. The Masoretic text was written by the Masoretes, who were a Jewish group that dedicated themselves to copying their scripture word for word as it was written. So they were printing presses before it was cool. They, of course, copied these by hand, and they checked for typos by making sure they counted the number of syllables and lines in every one of their translations and word orders. In fact, they took this so seriously that when they made claims about not only their nation's history but God's character, when they came across the name of the God of Israel, it was Masoretic tradition, the Masoretes, the individuals who were making these copies, to put down their pen when they came to the Yod-Hath, Vav-Hath, the Yahweh that we see as Lord in all caps in our translations today, the covenant name of God. They would put down their pen, their little quill or whatever they used, take a ceremonial bath, write the name, then bathe again, and then go back into translating. Now, when you get into some of the Psalms and you see Lord, Lord, Lord all over the place, you can imagine these guys are pretty squeaky clean after one of their copying days. But you can also note from that passion that they took this job very seriously. And also note that if they were aware of a single mistake in their copying, they would destroy the entire scroll and start over. Now, the earliest copy of their work that we have is dated to around the 900s AD in the modern era. But when we also take into consideration this very, very significant portion of text, what does it prove? What is all this boring information about how many copies and this and that in what way? I'm teaching you guys and showing you guys in a very simple and straightforward manner why we can trust the Bible, how to test it, how to know that what you're reading is in fact the Bible that they read. And given the fact that if we're going to be fair with our criticism and what we want to be is fair, we have more reason to trust the transmission of the Old Testament, noting the Masoretic text and the amount of meticulous detail they made in getting their Bible transmitted through the ages. We have a comparison from 900 AD to 300 BC, over 12,000 or 1200 rather years of history, and no noticeable changes apart from alterations in the languages itself. Note, we do recognize typos, but know exactly where, when, and why they would be put in and mistaken. But when you ask yourself the question, oh, well, does it make a difference whether a king was 8 or 18 when his heart turned from the Lord and began burning cities and raping women? Well, you think about that for a second and say, well, it'd be very hard to engage in both of those activities, especially one in particular if you were 8 years old. 18 seems more likely. Also, the number of horses that Solomon's stables could support, the zeros were a bit off. But you ask yourself, okay, what's the total number of horses that Solomon could support in his stables? Well, we can dig them up and find out which translation is accurate. Is it 200,000 or is it 2,000? Well, is any of that going to change whether or not Israel, Solomon, or anything else that the Bible has said was real? It's really superficial when you get down to the nitty-gritty. So that is the first form of criticism, taking the oldest to our most recent, and we would say, based on that standard, there are no noticeable changes that have been made to the text. It has been reliably transmitted as long as a language would allow in the transmission from Hebrew into Greek and Greek into the languages we are speaking today. Now, speaking of Greek, this is where we find the majority text, the most numerous copy of the Bible that was used before the time of before the Masoretic text was utilized most popularly, and certainly before the Dead Sea Scrolls. The one that bears the most weight in this category and department would be our second test, is the majority number. Well, how much can we compare with the most evidence? And this would be the Septuagint. The Septuagint, which is oftentimes shown as LXX, the Roman numerals for 70, or you note the point, the numerals for 70 in the ancient world, dates to around 200 years before Christ, but of course we didn't discover it then. We've dated it to then because we have references to it being utilized around that time. But when the Old Testament was used by the Jews to understand their history as well as their theology and their culture, it was a very trying time for them when the Hellenistic, the Greek Empire, came through and unified this empire through speaking Greek. The road system that he implemented that was later improved upon by the Romans standardized all of these things by saying that Greek was the language of trade, that if you wanted to make it in Alexander the Great's empire, you needed to be able to communicate with the people that were traveling and passing through. This road system made that so it was something that they took for granted. Caravans weren't just for the elite and very special occasions, but for the most part you were on your own as far as your culture and society is concerned. It was based on this wide, like entire Middle East and parts of Europe, wide empire, going all the way to the borders of India, and the road system accomplished this. But when the Jews suddenly had to, well, communicate with all of these traders exactly why they weren't selling or buying idols and why they weren't engaging in the trade of certain animals like pigs and camels, or at least for consumption and so forth. They had to explain their culture, and they also wanted to make sure they had a knowledge and understanding of who the true and living God of all the earth was. They didn't keep this knowledge to themselves, at least not until the time of Jesus. It's also worth mentioning that when the Septuagint was made for this purpose, so that the Greek-speaking audiences in the known world at the time would have access to and be able to understand the Old Testament. This wasn't something that the Jews themselves wrote, or for themselves, but it was for the international community. And they did a very good job, as far as the Greek language could allow, in translating their language in Hebrew to the Greek language. Now, of all the copies that we have, the total number that we can test would be as follows. Of course, the earliest is the Dead Sea Scrolls, then would come the Septuagint, then the Cairo Codex, which is a big leap. We go from 200 BC in the Septuagint, 300 for the Dead Sea Scrolls. The next major and complete copy that we have is the Cairo Codex in 895 AD. So that's 1100-year jump. But noting that we can test the transmission between those three with our first standard, we're looking at all of these. We have the Petersburg Codex in Russia. We have the Aleppo Codex, the Leningrad Codex, the Cambridge Codex, and these are all over a 200-year period of history. And finally, the Codex Vaticanus, Alexandrinus, and Saravanius, noticing whether I'm pronouncing that right. The Greek translations would include the Old and New Testament. The Old Testament within these, they all line up with each other. So then making the comparisons between the two then and testing if we have plenty of copies to test and compare with what we have today. If we have very early copies to test with what we have today. What about what we know about the ancient world and what the Old Testament has to say? Are there examples, for instance, of historical anachronisms? Does it make historical claims that we can test and verify as having never happened? Do they say that someone was living at the wrong time of history, and are dates for these individuals? We are informed enough about both to say there is a difference. Well, I want to give 3 examples for the sake of time. I've held you here for almost a half hour now, and I thank you again for the time. I want to give 3 examples of things that we can verify that give us every reason to trust that the authors of the Old Testament knew what they were talking about. We can test by others, but these are the ones that we can most easily and plainly verify as far as historical criticism is concerned. When it comes to the existence, say, for certain individuals, we can do entire studies on them, but for the sake of time, I just want to pick these 3 examples. The first is when Moses, who was the author of Genesis through most of the book of Deuteronomy, in the 14th century BC, he refers to the cities of Pithom and Ramses in the book of Exodus. And during that time where the Jews were staying and helping construct these cities from their settlement in Goshen, Pithom and Ramses were ordered to be built by the Pharaoh during the time that Moses asked for an extended weekend, that they would go into the wilderness to worship their God and then return without a fuss. Now, you all know what happened. Ultimately, Pharaoh pushed the envelope so far that God said, all right, you're never coming back to this guy, and he's going to be judged. But nonetheless, he made a claim that when the Pharaoh didn't like it that the people of Israel wanted a 3-day weekend and said, oh, you guys must have all this free time on your hands. I know what'll keep you guys busy. I want you to not only continue your daily brick quota in constructing these sort of things as slaves, but on top of that, I'm not going to supply you the resources. You're going to have to retrieve the straw as well as the materials that you would need to make these bricks. We're not going to provide that for you. So the Jews made every effort to keep up with their daily quota. They were good citizens in the land of Egypt despite the persecution they were going under. And they report that they progressively ran out of more and more straw, that they had to make bricks with this sort of stability within them that eventually turned into using scraps of straw, whatever they could get a hold of. And then finally, they had to make bricks without the straw, hoping that they dried solid and didn't crumble. Well, we can test that claim if we go to the cities of Ramses and Pithom, which are still around today. We dig down to the time that we believe would be in the area of Moses' time. A lot of things can happen between now and then, and generally when you destroy a city, you level it and you build on top of it again. So people dig down when they see these mounds, what are called atolls, and they see what kind of civilizations were around before it. Well, we dug into the areas of Pithom and Ramses in particular, and we were looking at all of the bricks. And there was never any ruined structures that had any bricks without straw or decreasing amounts of straw within them. Until they decided to dig a little bit further, and they discovered an entirely new city that was known as Avaris. And Avaris would have been the namesake it was called during this time, but because as the translators were making the the information available for people in their time, they needed to clarify. It was known as Ramses, but it wasn't Ramses at the time. The city of Avaris included many ruins that we were able to excavate, including but not limited to an estate that they can pretty soundly conclude belonged to Joseph and his 12 brothers. There was a grand statue dedicated to a Semitic individual, not an Egyptian, but who held badges of office. And on top of the 12 tombs he had in his estate, his bones were missing, lining up with what they did with Joseph's bones after they departed from Egypt. And on top of that as well, his statue includes scraps of the coloring and the dyes that they used on the statue that had survived this long, and realized he had a pretty colorful coat. But I digress. We're talking about the bricks. Did they find the bricks? Yes, they did. They did find temples and buildings and tombs that were being made from these bricks, but for some reason had a decreasing amount of straw in them, backing up or corroborating the account that we read in Exodus and falling in line with the date. The second piece of evidence I'd like to point out to you is that when in Genesis, remember Moses was the author of Genesis, but he lived around 1450 BC. He was writing about things that were explained to him by God as far as his culture and his history are concerned, going all the way from the time of creation to their time when they just arrived in Egypt, the time of Joseph. Now, they knew who Joseph was, but they didn't know about all the details of his family history, let alone Adam, in that explicit detail yet. The only one who could be an eyewitness to these things and give an accurate report would be the one who created them, God. And he's the one who gave this account to Moses, supposedly. How do we test that? Well, as a Christian, I want to find a positive answer. So I ask myself, what sort of details would Moses not have known but have been able to record if God was in fact talking to him? Well, there's one in particular that we can test, and it was what was compared to the Code of Hammurabi. It is a very ancient and pre-biblical series of laws. Atheists are aware of this as well, where it includes a very specific law that if someone were to steal the household gods, the family idols of a house and a family and a home, that they would be put to death, that this was a capital offense. And for those of you who remember, Abraham grew up in the city of Ur, and his relatives, then those in which he later had his son return back to and marry into, those who he could trust the integrity of, to want a knowledge of the true and living God. Abraham sent his son Isaac to marry Rebekah, and Rebekah produced Jacob and Esau. Now, when Jacob returned to his homeland as well, remember, they're in the Babylonian Peninsula, the region that would have been under this influence, but was 500 years removed from the time of Moses. So Moses is writing about something 500 years before his time. He wouldn't have known this. But Jacob, when he flees his home with Laban, takes the wives, takes the children, takes all his resources, everything that he legally owns rightly. He hasn't done anything wrong, but goes back to Canaan. And Rachel, one of Jacob's wives, steals her father's gods. I don't know if it was to worship them or because she wanted to pawn them for the gold and silver that they were made of. We aren't told her motives. Well, kind of we are, but that's a little bit more detailed of a study. Rachel steals her father's gods, and Laban is plumb ticked by this, so much so, in fact, that he was plotting to kill Jacob, and if God hadn't intervened by visiting Laban in a dream and saying, "Whatever you do to him, I will do to you," he comes in quite smiley and says, "Hi, Jacob. I just wanted to say goodbye to my grandkids. Why'd you guys leave so soon? Don't, uh, don't come back. Why'd you steal my gods, by the way?" So I didn't steal your gods, and Rachel does this little move that allows her to get away with it. But the point being made is this: why would Moses make up a custom that stealing gods would be something someone would be so mad about that they would, within the laws of their own culture, be able to murder someone over, when that law didn't exist 500 years before or after this time? Why would Moses have been aware of them? Unless, of course, he was made aware of them by someone who was there. Gets its history right. Then finally, the third and my personal favorite one is in the book of Isaiah, as well as in 2 Kings, where Isaiah records the Assyrian army, not the Syrian, the Assyrian army, being wiped out by a single angel during the reign of Sennacherib. Now, King Sennacherib had a prism that was dedicated to himself, and it's known as the Taylor Prism today. You can visit it in the British Museum, but it backs up this story not in the account of the angel, because note, what politician, let alone king, who's going to make a big slab monument to all of his feats during his reign, is going to admit something embarrassing, like, for example, one of the spiritual creations of the god of a foreign nation single-handedly wiping out what was supposed to be the world-dominating empire at the time? Well, if you go to the Taylor Prism in the British Museum and you check out the very end of the account, Sennacherib's life ultimately ends when he hears of a rebellion and insurrection in Ethiopia, which was generally what they just referred to as all of northern Africa. And he went to answer the threat to secure his borders in Egypt. And as he was passing through Jerusalem, and as the accounts in Isaiah note, he sends his representative and messenger, a guy by the name of Rabshakeh. Some believe Rabshakeh is a title, others that was his actual name. Doesn't matter. But the individual tells the people of Israel, hey, the gods of the other nations couldn't save them. What makes your God think that he can save you from us? And Hezekiah was a smart one. He said, well, this is God's problem now. He can defend his honor. And he left the scroll that included the threat on it in the temple and said, hey, God, you're going to deal with this because we can't. And the prophet Isaiah met the king Hezekiah outside of the temple before he had gotten back to his palace and said, God's heard your prayer, and he wants to let you know that not one arrow will fly into this city. Well, that would be very hard, even under, average circumstances. Maybe some soldiers just going to let one off and try to do some target practice at a bird or something. This was a very easily falsifiable prophecy. But what happened? Well, we're told in Isaiah 38, the entire army was wiped out. Now imagine that from Sennacherib's perspective. Imagine the king of what was at one time, like a day ago, leader of a world-ruling empire. 185,000 foot soldiers, and these guys were psychopaths, by the way. You can read about their exploits in the historical records of Herodotus. He was a Greek historian, by the way. But when he gets up, he leads out his tent. He's smelling breakfast, but it's not as pleasant as he remembered. And then he realizes that's not animals cooking. Those are Why is everyone dead? 185,000 soldiers, and he's just left there going, ugh, I'm gonna go home now. And that's exactly what he did. He went home without a word, and in the city of Nineveh, one of the most large building structures and capital fortresses of its time, you got 185,000 apparently widows and their kids and their grandmas, and especially the three sons of Sennacherib, who want to know, Dad, where's our army? King, where's my husband? Where's the loot from all of our conquests? Where's the spoils of battle? What happened with the Ethiopians? Why are you so scared? Why are you praying in the temple of one of your gods, begging him for an explanation? You know what? I think something happened here, and his sons murder him that night. Well, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense if you remove the biblical account. You just read Sennacherib's tablet, or his prism, and you think, so he went down to Ethiopia, he got to right about halfway down the Middle East, where we call Jerusalem today. He just turned around and went home, and we never hear about his army again. What happened? Well, you don't get an answer from the Taylor prism, but you do get a pretty good parallel account in the Bible. And so, for these reasons and others, employing fair textual criticism in the Old Testament, we can conclude that we are, in fact, reading honest and accurate history. When it comes to the transmission and translation, we'll be doing not just textual criticism, but historical criticism very soon. But I want to make sure that you all understand these things. You can look up and clarify the other details that people go into all of these sort of things, unnecessary corrections and so forth. People who make claims that sections of Jeremiah don't necessarily match up, but if you take the time to consider both perspectives and wonder, is it more reasonable to say that Jeremiah just developed in his writing style over time or not? If you say, oh, well, this style doesn't match that style, but then wonder, is Jeremiah obligated to follow a particular style over 50 years of his life? And on it goes. You can pretty much piece this together, and even admitting the majority of their claims where they say, oh, there's this there and this error and that error, none of the New Testament's historicity is called into question without making some major assumptions in the first place. Like, say, for example, the Bible can't be history because it says that there's a God. We know God doesn't exist, therefore the Bible's false. Yeah, you have to do a bit better than that. But if on the other hand, when it comes to the text itself and how we judge ancient history, the Old Testament is a document that is just as testable as any other. In fact, it has more evidence than most. Next time, we'll be going over the New Testament, which, by the way, has more evidence to support it than any piece of ancient literature in all of existence. But that will be next time. I'll look forward to talking to you all about that then, but for this time, if you have sincere questions and want to know more, leave them in the comments below. If you'd like to encourage the ministry, you know where to go, but most importantly, if you know someone that would benefit from hearing these simple facts just laid out audibly in this way, when you're playing games or doing something else, and you could use this as some background information to absorb and strengthen your understanding of the Bible, and perhaps encourage further study. The research of Daniel Wallace and many others are greatly encouraged. But with all that said, I want to thank you for your time. I want to remind you that Jesus loves you and that we can trust the Old Testament. And until then, I'll look forward to when we can discuss the New.